Hey guys, tonight we're going to ease ourselves into the unimaginable reality of surviving the siege of Leningrad. Imagine the biting cold of a Russian winter seeping into your bones, the hollow ache in your stomach becoming your constant companion, and the world outside your frozen city walls feeling like another planet entirely. This wasn't just hardship, it was a prolonged, deliberate strangulation. And frankly, you probably wouldn't have survived it. It's a brutal thought, I know, but focusing on the boring day-to-day struggle can be surprisingly effective for calming the mind. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you want, drop a comment with your location and the time, joining our little global community of sleepy history buffs. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So there you are, living your life in Leningrad in the late summer of 1941. Maybe you were working in a factory, or perhaps you were a student, or just trying to keep your family fed in what was already a pretty uncertain time. News arrives, often filtered, sometimes contradictory. The Germans are advancing, fast, faster than anyone really wants to admit. But Leningrad is a huge, important city, a symbol. Surely it won't be isolated, right? That seems excessive, impossible almost. Then the impossible happens. It feels sudden, like a door slamming shut. One day trains are rumbling in, trucks are delivering goods, and the next the routes are cut. Not just slowed down, but gone. You hear the front lines have moved, shifted, and suddenly your city is an island in a sea of enemy forces. The shock ripples through the population. At first, maybe it's disbelief, a temporary setback, surely, a strategic pause. Nobody really planned for this, not properly. The official line downplays it, of course. Temporary difficulties, they might say. The enemy will be repulsed. Meanwhile, you notice the shops. Remember that trip to the baker just last week, where you tutted at the short queue? Now the queues snake around the block before dawn. The shelves empty with alarming speed. Sugar, gone. Flour, a distant memory. Even things you took for granted, like soap or matches, become precious commodities. You clutch your ration card, a flimsy piece of paper that suddenly feels heavier than lead. It's the key to, well, not exactly abundance, but the official sliver of survival. You might look at it and think, okay, this isn't generous, but we can manage for a bit, right? Oh, sweet summer child, this is just the gentle opening act of starvation, the prelude to a very long, very hungry opera. The realization dawns slowly for some, like a creeping dread. For others, it hits like a punch to the gut when they see the dwindling supplies in the store, or the pale, anxious faces of their neighbors. You start talking to people, hushed conversations in stairwells or crowded trams. Did you hear? There's almost no grain left. They say the Germans are just going to wait for us to starve. It feels like a rumor at first, something too cruel to be true. Starve a whole city? Who would do that? Historians still argue whether the initial German objective was truly to starve Leningrad into submission from the outset, or if the full scale of the siege's lethality evolved from battlefield conditions and strategic choices. It's a grim debate centering on the intention behind unimaginable suffering. You start to notice the details, the official announcements about new rationing categories, the sight of people carrying sacks of potatoes that look suspiciously like they were dug from someone's private garden, the slightly manic gleam in someone's eye when they talk about a hidden stash of salted fish from before the war. It's not panic in the streets yet, not full-blown chaos. It's a simmering anxiety, a collective tightening of the chest. You check your own larder, a few cans of something, maybe a sack of potatoes if you were lucky or prepared, some pickled vegetables. It suddenly looks inadequate, pathetically small. You mentally calculate how long it might last, dividing it by the number of people in your household. The numbers don't add up to months. They barely add up to weeks. It's funny in a dark way, the things you suddenly regret. That extra loaf of bread you didn't buy last week because you thought you'd save a few kopecks. The lingering arguments about finishing the leftovers. The sheer, blissful ignorance of ever throwing food away. Oh, you'll learn not to waste a single crumb, not even the dust from the bottom of a flour sack. You'll become an expert in making something out of nothing, but that's later. Right now, it's just the shock, the growing fear, the slow, horrible understanding that the world has shrunk to the size of this besieged city, and everything vital is outside its walls. A weird early sign that things were dire? Reportedly, one of the first items to vanish from stores wasn't just staples, but things like yeast and baking soda, as people immediately tried to stockpile ingredients for making their own bread, perhaps misunderstanding the true scale of the incoming flour shortage. It was a tiny, almost hopeful act of self-sufficiency in the face of overwhelming yet still abstract doom. The concrete fact was the city's primary supply lines were severed around September 8, 1941, closing the noose tight. That date marked the real beginning of the city's long, torturous isolation. You feel that date not just as a number, but as a physical constraint. The city is sealed, and you are inside. The city is sealed, and you are inside. That creeping dread you felt in Section 1, it doesn't creep anymore. It settles in your stomach like a lead weight, a physical emptiness that will soon become the defining sensation of your existence. Because the official word comes quickly after the city is encircled. The rations, they're being cut, not by a little, but drastically. You remember clutching that flimsy card thinking it was a sliver of survival? Well, that sliver just got a whole lot thinner. Your daily bread allowance, which was already less than you'd ideally eat, is slashed. For manual laborers, it might drop to 500 grams. For everyone else, dependents, office workers, children, it goes down to a mere 250 grams. Think about that, 250 grams. That's about half a standard loaf of modern bread. Maybe a bit more depending on density, but the bread you'll get isn't standard by any stretch. It's dense, heavy, and shrinking. You stare at the number on the official notice, or hear it whispered with disbelief in the queues. 250 grams. Is that even enough to keep a bird alive? Let alone a human performing daily tasks in the brutal cold. The psychological impact is immediate and profound. Food wasn't just sustenance anymore. It was hope. It was a measurable quantity that stood between you and, well, the unthinkable. And now, that quantity has shrunk to something almost contemptible. It's like being told you need to run a marathon, and the organizers have decided to give you only half a bottle of water for the entire race. You see people's faces in the queues. The initial anxiety gives way to a kind of stunned despair. Some weep quietly, others stand with a sort of grim, unblinking stare, already starting to process the impossible math of survival on so little. Life quickly reorients itself entirely around the ration card. It's your golden ticket, your most prized possession. Losing it is not an inconvenience. It's a death sentence. You guard it with obsessive care. You learn exactly when the bread is delivered to your local distribution point, if it is delivered at all that day. The queues form hours beforehand, a silent, shuffling line of humanity defined by their need. Standing in line becomes a significant part of your day, maybe even the most important part. You chat quietly with neighbors, sharing rumors, anxieties, and tiny scraps of information. Did you get your full ration yesterday? They say the flour quality is getting worse. These conversations aren't casual. They are vital intelligence gathering. The quality of the bread ration starts to decline almost immediately as well. The bakers are faced with critically low supplies of traditional wheat flour. Necessity, as they say, is the mother of invention. But in this case, invention means adding other things that aren't flour. You remember the talk of almost no grain left from Section 1? Well, the grain is stretching thinner than cheap elastic. They start incorporating cellulose, sawdust, even some sort of edible paste made from boiled leather and bones at later. More desperate stages, but even now in these early cuts, the bread is different. It's dark, heavy, and doesn't taste quite right. It tastes like survival scraped from the bottom of the barrel. You might look at this dark, dense loaf, if you're lucky enough to get one, and think, this is bread. It feels like a brick. It is and it isn't. It's mostly filler. a symbolic gesture of calories. You become intimately familiar with hunger, not just missing a meal or feeling peckish. This is a deep, gnawing ache that never leaves. It's a constant, low-level hum in your gut. Your body starts talking to you in ways you never knew possible, demanding fuel it isn't getting. You think about food constantly. Recipes run through your head. Memories of meals you used to take for granted become agonizingly vivid. A simple plate of potatoes, a slice of real butter, a cup of hot milk. These things become the stuff of extravagant fantasy. It's a weird mental state where your mind is buzzing with hunger while your body is slowly powering down. One mainstream historical fact is that these first severe ration cuts were implemented in Leningrad on September 12, 1941, just 4 days after the city was fully encircled. This wasn't a gradual tightening, it was an immediate, sharp blow that signaled the brutal nature of the coming months. A quirky tidbit that illustrates the early resourcefulness, or perhaps desperation, is that people quickly began boiling and eating wallpaper paste, especially older types made from organic materials like potato starch, hoping to extract any minimal caloric value. Imagine scraping your walls for dinner. That's the level we're heading towards. Historians still argue whether the Soviet authorities could have better prepared the city with larger food stockpiles given the intelligence available about the German advance, or if the speed of the encirclement made a truly adequate reserve impossible regardless of foresight. It's another layer of what if on a pile of suffering. You walk through the streets and the signs of the siege become unavoidable. The constant sound of distant artillery fire, the air raid sirens becoming a regular, dreaded soundtrack to your life. But underneath the sounds of war, there's a more insidious, quiet change. The collective energy of the city is draining away, 1 calorie at a time. You see it in the slower pace of pedestrians, the slightly sunken eyes, the conversations that inevitably drift back to food or the lack thereof. Even jokes, the brief, flickering moments of dark humor, often revolve around hunger. Saw a cat chasing its tail yesterday, someone might mutter. Poor thing probably thinks it's a sausage. Not exactly laugh out loud stuff, but it's a way of acknowledging the absurdity of the situation. This is survival becoming truly boring, stripped of any heroic narrative, reduced to the monotonous, soul-crushing pursuit of just not starving today. The gnawing ache from the reduced ration in Section 2 doesn't magically disappear when you finish your minuscule piece of bread. In fact, it often seems to intensify, mocking the brief, fleeting sensation of having eaten something. Your old job, whatever it was, maybe you worked in a factory or an office or were a student, suddenly feels abstract, almost irrelevant. The real job, the all-consuming occupation that dictates every waking thought, is finding enough calories to survive the next 24 hours. Your ration card is the absolute baseline, the foundation of survival, but it's clearly not enough. Not even close. You have to become a hunter-gatherer in a besieged modern city, a bizarre inversion of civilization. This means you start looking at the world differently. Everything becomes a potential source of sustenance or a means to acquire it. Parks, gardens, vacant lots, they're no longer just green spaces, they're foraging grounds. You walk slower, eyes scanning the ground, the bushes, even the cracks in the pavement. A dandelion root? Maybe. Some withered berries clinging to a bush? Definitely worth checking. You remember tending a small patch of potatoes or vegetables in a communal garden plot if you were lucky enough to have one. Now every single potato, every carrot, every leafy green is guarded like gold. People become fiercely protective of their small harvests, and the risk of theft is ever present. You might plant late into the year, hoping against hope that something matures before the frost locks the ground solid. The search extends beyond cultivated areas. Trees in the city parks that you used to admire for their shade or beauty are now assessed for edible bark or leaves, though you quickly learn which ones are palatable. Spoiler, most aren't, and many will make you sick. Grass, maybe if boiled long enough, though it offers virtually no nutritional value and tastes dreadful. You start noticing things you never did before, places where people might discard scraps, areas where resourceful neighbors have already stripped everything bare. It's a silent, often competitive race against thousands of other hungry people doing the exact same thing. You learn to spot the subtle signs that someone else has been there first. A recently disturbed patch of earth, a broken branch, footprints leading to a promising-looking spot that turns out to be empty. This constant scrounging isn't just physically demanding, it's emotionally exhausting. The hope you feel when you spot something potentially edible is quickly dashed by the reality. It's frozen solid, or rotten, or someone else got there first. The sheer amount of effort required to find a handful of bitter leaves or a couple of forgotten potato peels is soul-crushing. You boil everything, of course, endlessly boiling things you wouldn't have dreamed of eating before, trying to make them digestible, trying to extract even the faintest hint of energy. Your small kitchen stove, if you still have fuel for it, becomes a makeshift laboratory of desperation, filled with the smells of boiling roots, strange leaves, and other unidentifiable foraged items. The taste is usually awful, a bitter, gritty reminder of how far you have fallen. Sometimes you find slightly better things. Maybe you manage to trade something valuable, a family heirloom, a piece of clothing, something from your pre-siege life, for a handful of dried peas or a small block of animal fat, and son, if anyone still has any. These transactions happen in hushed tones, away from prying eyes, in apartments or back alleys. The value of things has flipped completely. Money is increasingly useless. It's food, or things that can be traded for food, that hold real worth. Your grandmother's antique teapot, worth maybe a cup of groats if you're lucky. A bag of potatoes? Priceless. This rapid shift in value is disorienting, a stark illustration of how quickly the veneer of normal life has been stripped away. You hear stories, rumors about what others are eating. People boiling leather belts and shoes, trying to make a gelatinous, nutrient-poor soup. Others are said to be catching and eating stray cats and dogs, an unthinkable act just weeks ago, now discussed with a grim pragmatism. Pigeons become a prized target for anyone with the means to catch them. You might see someone trying to set a snare or patiently waiting to strike, their focus absolute. It's not pretty, it's not pleasant, but the hunger overrides almost everything else. You might tell yourself you would never do such a thing, but the constant ache in your stomach is a powerful, persuasive force. A mainstream historical fact is that during the siege of Leningrad, public parks and squares, including the summer garden in the Field of Mars, were converted into vegetable plots in a desperate attempt to increase food production within the besieged city. People risked shelling to tend these plots. A quirky tidbit is that despite the extreme hunger, many residents maintained a sense of civic duty and tried to keep the city clean, even organizing volunteer brigades to clear snow or debris, although their energy levels were critically low. It's a bizarre mix of desperation and ingrained habit. Historians still argue whether the centralized distribution system, reliant on ration cards, was the most equitable method under siege conditions, or if allowing more free market trade would have led to different outcomes. Perhaps saving some but exploiting others more severely. There are arguments for both sides, lost in the echoes of suffering. The pursuit of food becomes a constant calculation. Is it worth the risk of an air raid to search that abandoned building for scraps? Is that strange plant potentially edible? Or will it make you violently ill in a state where illness is often fatal? Every choice is weighted by the desperate need for calories. You might share tips with close neighbors, forming small, informal survival groups, or you might become fiercely secretive, guarding any small discovery. Trust becomes a precious commodity, easily broken by hunger. It's a strange, isolating existence, even surrounded by millions of other people. Your world shrinks to the distance you can walk, the energy you have to search, and the constant, boring, all-important question, what can I possibly eat today? That question, what can I possibly eat today, becomes a dull, relentless hum in the background of your consciousness. It's there when you wake up, a cold, empty feeling that starts in your stomach and seems to spread throughout your entire being. It's there when you walk, slowing your steps, making every movement feel heavier than it should. And it's definitely there when you try to sleep, your body screaming for nourishment even as exhaustion claims you. This isn't just physical hunger, it's a deep existential ache that begins to redefine who you are. Your thoughts narrow, simplifying down to the primal need. Complex ideas, future plans, abstract concepts, they all fade into the background, replaced by the immediate, urgent reality of caloric intake. Your brain, starved of energy, feels like it's wrapped in cotton wool. It's hard to concentrate, hard to remember things, hard to feel much of anything beyond the omnipresent hunger and a low-level thrum of anxiety. This cognitive fog is a protective mechanism of sorts, perhaps allowing you to focus solely on the necessary tasks for survival. But it also strips away parts of your personality, your ability to connect with others in meaningful ways. Small irritations become insurmountable hurdles. Minor setbacks feel catastrophic. You might find yourself staring blankly at a wall for long periods, energy too depleted even for worry. It's a strangely passive state, punctuated only by the active, desperate search for food. And the social landscape shifts dramatically, mirroring the internal changes. That neighbor you used to chat with about the weather or the latest news? Now you eye them with suspicion. What did they find today? Are they hiding something? Did they get to that foraging spot before you? The shared struggle should theoretically unite people, and in some cases it does. Small pockets of mutual aid persist, neighbors sharing meager resources or looking out for each other during air raids. But more often, the instinct for self-preservation trumps communal solidarity. The bonds of polite society fray and snap under the relentless pressure of hunger. You might avoid eye contact on the street, not wanting to see the same desperation reflected in someone else's eyes. Or worse, the flicker of envy or potential threat. Trust becomes a luxury you can barely afford. If someone offers you food, your first thought isn't gratitude, but suspicion. Why are they offering it? What do they want in return? Are they sick? The risk of being cheated or even attacked for your meager possessions or discoveries is very real. You learn to be guarded, to keep your own fine secret, to move through the city like a solitary predator or prey, depending on the situation. This constant vigilance is another layer of exhaustion, a low-grade stress that never truly goes away. You become adept at reading subtle cues, the way someone walks, the direction they're looking, the tension in their posture, trying to gauge if they are a threat or just another hungry soul. Though honestly, in this situation, everyone is a potential threat to your food supply, even if it's just by getting there first. It's a bit like trying to find a parking spot in rush hour, but if failing meant you wouldn't eat for days, way more stressful. Humor, that vital coping mechanism, becomes darker, more cynical. You might crack grim jokes with a trusted friend, if you still have one you can truly trust, about the latest bizarre thing people are trying to eat, or the sheer absurdity of trying to maintain any semblance of normal life. Laughter is rare, and when it comes, it's often a brittle sound, quickly extinguished by the returning weight of reality. The future is no longer something you plan for, it's just the next few hours, the next ration distribution, the next desperate search for a forgotten root or a discarded scrap of protein. Your world shrinks, focusing intensely on the immediate, the tangible, the edible. You start to see the world through a different lens, one calibrated purely for survival. Aesthetics disappear, utility is everything. A beautiful ornate carving on a building? Could it be made of wood that might burn for fuel? A leather armchair? Could the leather be boiled down? Everything is assessed for its potential caloric value or its ability to help you acquire calories or heat. This utilitarian view extends to people too, in a grim way. You might unconsciously assess someone's physical state. Are they weaker than you? Could they be a target if things get desperate enough? It's a thought you immediately push away, but the fact that it even surfaces is a terrifying indicator of how much you've changed. A mainstream historical fact from the siege of Leningrad is that despite the horrific conditions and starvation, many cultural institutions attempted to continue functioning. Libraries remained open when possible, public lectures were given, and even concerts and theatrical performances were held, albeit for dwindling audiences of emaciated citizens and soldiers. A quirky tidbit relates to one of the city's most treasured institutions, the Hermitage Museum. Its vast collection of art was evacuated early in the siege. But the empty museum buildings were kept heated and guarded by staff who refused to abandon their posts, even using the basements as bomb shelters for locals. It's a stark contrast to the survival desperation happening outside the walls. Historians still argue whether this effort to maintain cultural life during such extreme physical hardship was a remarkable act of human resilience in defiance against the siege's attempt to dehumanize, or if it was a futile, almost absurd use of precious energy and resources that should have been directed solely towards survival. There are compelling points on both sides of that difficult question. This process of hardening, of narrowing your focus and withdrawing emotionally, isn't a conscious decision at first. It's a slow, insidious change, creeping in like the cold. You become quieter, less expressive. Small talk feels like an impossible effort. Why waste energy on pleasantries when there are more important things, like figuring out how to make that piece of boiled leather slightly more palatable? Hint, you can't. Your face probably settles into a neutral mask, conserving energy, giving nothing away. The person you were before the siege feels increasingly like a character in a book, someone you once knew but is now distant and unfamiliar. You are becoming someone shaped entirely by lack of food, lack of warmth, lack of safety, lack of hope. And that person is tough, resilient in a terrifying way, but also isolated and emotionally blunted. It's not a fun transformation, let me tell you. Definitely not the kind of self-improvement guru stuff you see online today. No glow up here, just a fade out of the non-essential bits. That narrowing focus we talked about, that shrinking of your world down to the immediate, the edible, it's driven by a hunger that doesn't just make your stomach rumble. It becomes a physical ache, a low-grade pain that's always there. It gnaws at you, a constant reminder of your body's desperate need. And as the official rations dwindle, becoming pitifully small, sometimes not even appearing, that gnawing hunger drives you to look for things you never would have considered food before. This is where desperation truly heightens, and a grim kind of resourcefulness sharpens your senses. You start scanning the ground, the streets, the abandoned buildings, not for valuables, but for anything organic that might offer a sliver of caloric value. Your eyes, once maybe drawn to architectural details or people's faces, now meticulously search for patches of grass growing in crevices, for weeds pushing up through the pavement, for any sign of plant life that isn't frozen solid. Common weeds like dandelions or nettles, if you can find them, become prized possessions. You learn which roots might be edible, though they're often bitter and tough, requiring long boiling to soften them even slightly. Honestly, boiling them for hours probably uses more precious fuel than the calories you get back. But the hope of nutrition is a powerful motivator. The search extends beyond the natural world into the manufactured one. Leather becomes a target. Old shoes, belts, briefcases, anything made of animal hide. You acquire a piece, perhaps bartering something else equally useless for food, or finding it discarded. The process is horrific. You have to scrape off any dirt, polish, or non-leather parts. Then it's boiled, and boiled, and boiled again, sometimes for days, hoping to render it slightly softer, slightly more digestible. The resulting substance is tough, rubbery, and possesses very little nutritional value, mostly just filling your stomach with indigestible material. People try to improve it, adding a pinch of salt if they have it, or boiling it with any scavenged vegetable scraps, but it's still fundamentally, unyieldingly leather. It's not exactly a dish you'll find on a celebrity chef's menu anytime soon. You might also hear whispers, rumors, about other sources. Dogs and pets, once beloved pets, vanish from the streets. You try not to think about where they went, but you know. Pigeons become targets, if you have the means to catch one. Even rats, despised vermin, are hunted, though the risk of disease is high. Nothing with potential calories is truly off limits anymore, which is a terrifying line to cross. The moral boundaries you once took for granted blur into shades of gray, then simply disappear under the crushing weight of starvation. You do what you have to do to survive another day, and you try not to judge others for doing the same, because who are you to talk? Wallpaper paste, made from cellulose, was sometimes consumed, offering zero nutritional value but creating a temporary feeling of fullness. Sawdust was mixed into meager flour rations to stretch them out, resulting in bread that was incredibly dense, gritty, and barely digestible, often causing severe intestinal distress. Bone glue derived from boiling down animal bones was another desperate measure. Again, more about bulk than nutrition. You become an involuntary expert in what your body can't process effectively, learning through painful trial and error what passes through you and what causes agony. Spoiler alert, a lot causes agony. This resourcefulness is often a solitary, secretive act. You don't broadcast what you're trying to eat. It's a source of shame, and also revealing a source of food, however grim, means immediate competition. You might sneak out at dawn to pull up some frozen weed roots, hoping no one sees you. You boil your leather scraps behind closed doors, the faint, unpleasant smell, hopefully not attracting unwanted attention. There's a perverse ingenuity in finding ways to survive on so little, but it's born entirely of suffering, not innovation for its own sake. It's the kind of problem-solving that makes you question everything about human existence. A mainstream historical fact of the siege of Leningrad is that the winter of 1941 to 42 was exceptionally harsh, with temperatures dropping to 30 to 22 degrees and below. This extreme cold compounded the effects of starvation, making outdoor foraging even more difficult and deadly, freezing the ground solid and killing off any potential plant sources. A quirky or fringe tidbit is the extent to which people attempted to use non-food items. There are accounts of people trying to consume petroleum jelly, Vaseline, or even certain types of cosmetic creams, hoping for fats, with predictably disastrous results. Historians still argue whether the sheer scale of these desperate, unconventional food strategies highlights the incredible resilience of the human spirit pushed to the brink, or merely demonstrates the horrifying degree of suffering and dehumanization inflicted by the siege conditions. Was it a testament to the will to live, or simply the biological imperative overriding all else? It's a tough question, isn't it? Your body adapts in grim ways. Your metabolism slows drastically to conserve energy. You move slower, think slower. Your body starts to consume itself, burning fat reserves first, then muscle. You become emaciated, your clothes hanging loosely, your face gaunt. The constant cold outside, combined with the lack of internal fuel, means you are perpetually shivering, even indoors. The energy required just to stay warm feels like a massive drain you can't afford. This physical decline mirrors the emotional hardening from the previous section. You are literally wasting away, inside and out. And all the while you are engaged in this relentless, degrading search for something to put in your stomach. Anything at all, just to make it through another frozen, empty day. It's a kind of hell where your body is the main torture, and the only relief is finding a handful of boiled weeds or a strip of chewy leather. As your world shrinks and your focus narrows to the desperate hunt for calories, another grim constant begins to normalize. Death. It's everywhere. It's not a rare event, whispered about behind closed doors. It's on the streets, in the corridors of your building, sometimes even in your own room. Bodies become a common sight. At first, you might avert your gaze, a sense of horror and sorrow twisting in your gut. But after a while, you find yourself walking past, your eyes scanning for anything else. A piece of frozen wood, a potential weed, rather than dwelling on the fallen. The shock fades, replaced by a weary, bone-deep resignation. The sheer scale of mortality overwhelms the usual rituals. Funerals, wakes, formal burials. They become impossible luxuries in this frozen, starving city. The ground is frozen solid, too hard to dig graves. There isn't enough fuel or energy to hold ceremonies. There isn't enough strength left in the living to carry bodies long distances, let alone build coffins or prepare sites. So, the bodies accumulate. They are often left where they fell, or sometimes gathered and stacked in collection points, awaiting eventual, often mass burial when the thaw comes, or when a communal effort can be mustered. Seeing carts piled high with bodies, shrouded simply or not at all, becomes another grim tableau of daily life. It's like a macabre game of Tetris, except the pieces are people you once shared a city with. This constant proximity to death strips away its mystery and its power to shock. It becomes a logistical problem, a sign of another competitor gone, a stark reminder of your own precarious state. You might recognize someone you knew, a neighbor, a shopkeeper, maybe even a friend among the frozen forms, but the wave of grief you'd expect doesn't always come. Or maybe it does, but it's muted, quickly suppressed because you just don't have the emotional energy reserves for it. All your resources, physical and mental, are channeled into the single overriding goal: surviving this moment. Mourning feels like an indulgence you can't afford. It's a stark illustration of Maslow's hierarchy of needs being brutally reset. You're stuck firmly on the bottom rung, desperately trying to stay alive. The social contract around death dissolves. Helping someone who has collapsed might mean expending precious energy you don't have. Sharing your meager food, that boiled leather, remember? With someone clearly dying feels like signing your own death warrant. The instinct for self-preservation, amplified by the extreme conditions, overrides empathy. You see people stumble, fall, and not get up, and you keep walking. It's not because you are suddenly evil, it's because you are functioning on the most basic, primal level of survival. Your capacity for compassion is just another victim of the siege. If you ever wondered what happens when you run out of emotional bandwidth, well, here's your answer. It's not pretty. A mainstream historical fact of the siege of Leningrad is that the peak mortality occurred during the winter of 1941 to 42, particularly in January and February 1942, when tens of thousands of people died each month, primarily from starvation and cold. The city's resources were completely overwhelmed by the death rate. A quirky or fringe tidbit from survivor accounts is the unsettling silence that often fell over the city despite the crisis. People conserved energy, and there was little laughter, conversation, or even crying, in people like. The constant presence of death seemed to stifle the sounds of life itself. Historians still argue whether the psychological numbing observed during the siege, where people became outwardly indifferent to death and suffering, was a necessary adaptive coping mechanism for survival, allowing individuals to function under unbearable stress, or a profound and tragic loss of humanity that left deep scars on survivors. Was it resilience or psychological injury? Your own body's deterioration contributes to this acceptance of death. You see your own reflection, gaunt, hollow-eyed, and you see the path many are taking. The line between being alive and being one of the frozen forms in the street feels incredibly thin, sometimes just a few missed meals, if you can even call them that, away. This constant, tangible reminder of mortality changes your perspective profoundly. Future plans evaporate. You focus only on the next hour, the next day, if you're lucky. The grand sweep of history, the reasons for the war, political ideologies, they all fade into irrelevance compared to the immediate pressing reality of hunger, cold, and death. It's a strange kind of freedom, perhaps, being liberated from the anxieties of the future, but it comes at the cost of losing hope itself. You exist in a perpetual, frozen present, surrounded by the evidence of extinction. And still, despite seeing the odds, you keep searching for that next scrap of sustenance. A testament to that tiny, stubborn spark of life that refuses to be extinguished, even when reason suggests it's futile. It's not rational, it's just being alive, in the most brutal sense. While the frozen forms you pass on the street are the most obvious manifestations of the siege's toll, death has other, less visible agents at work. The relentless hunger and cold don't just starve and freeze you directly, they create a perfect storm for disease. Your body, deprived of essential nutrients, its immune system running on empty calories derived from, say, boiled leather, is no longer capable of fighting off even minor infections. And in the chaotic, unsanitary conditions of the besieged city, those minor infections are everywhere. It starts subtly, a nagging cough that won't go away, a persistent ache, a stomach rumble that isn't hunger, but something else entirely. Then comes the weakness. far beyond the general fatigue of starvation. Fevers spike, often accompanied by chills that shake your already shivering frame. Vomiting and diarrhea become terrifyingly common, each episode draining precious, irreplaceable fluids and electrolytes from your desiccated body. This isn't just a bit of food poisoning. This is dysentery, tearing through weakened populations like wildfire. Getting sick is, frankly, often a death sentence. The sanitation situation deteriorates rapidly. Without functioning plumbing or the energy and water to maintain hygiene, waste disposal becomes a huge problem. Latrines overflow, streets become fouled, and the simple act of getting water from the river, remember trudging to the frozen Neva, carries risks if the water isn't boiled properly. And finding fuel to boil water? Another impossible challenge. You're caught in a vicious circle worthy of a particularly cruel reality TV show. The lack of soap or the energy to even wash your hands means germs spread unchecked. You try to be careful, you really do. But in this environment, keeping clean feels like an absurd luxury. Typhus is another silent killer stalking the city. Spread by lice, which thrive in crowded, unwashed conditions, it brings raging fever, headaches, weakness, and often a distinctive rash. It's one thing to feel weak from hunger, but typhus adds delirium, a terrifying confusion that can make you wander disoriented into the freezing streets. Combating lice requires washing clothes and bodies regularly, something that becomes almost impossible when water is scarce and heating non-existent. You find yourself constantly scratching, a nervous habit born of necessity, checking your clothes and hair with numb fingers, trying to spot the tiny vectors of disease. It feels utterly demeaning, reduced to picking bugs off yourself just to avoid another potential killer. Talk about adding insult to mortal injury. Then there's scurvy. You might think of scurvy as a pirate's disease, something from old adventure stories about long sea voyages. But it's just a vitamin C deficiency. In Leningrad, fresh produce vanishes almost immediately. Vitamin C is hard to store long-term and impossible to synthesize by the body. Without it, collagen production breaks down. Gums bleed, teeth loosen, old wounds reopen, and bruises appear spontaneously. You might notice small red spots on your skin, tiny hemorrhages, joint pain becomes severe. Your body is literally falling apart at a cellular level because you haven't had an orange in months. It's a slow, painful deterioration that adds another layer of misery to the already overwhelming suffering. You start to see people with swollen, bleeding gums, their skin mottled and bruised, and you know that pirate's curse has landed right here in the middle of a modern city. Who knew oranges were so vital? Medical facilities, already stretched thin before the siege, are quickly overwhelmed. Doctors and nurses, themselves starving and freezing, do their best with dwindling supplies. Antibiotics are rare or non-existent. There's no IV fluid to rehydrate dysentery patients, no way to treat the underlying cause of scurvy beyond finding the food that doesn't exist. Hospitals become places where people often go to die, offering little more than shelter and a slightly warmer place for your final moments. The sheer number of sick makes isolation impossible, so diseases spread like wildfire within the hospitals themselves. It's a desperate situation, a grim irony that the places meant to heal often become centers of contagion. A mainstream historical fact is that during the worst months of the siege, disease, particularly dysentery and typhus, significantly contributed to the death toll alongside starvation and cold, especially among those weakened by malnutrition. The lack of adequate food, water, and sanitation created ideal conditions for outbreaks. A quirky or fringe tidbit, often shared in survivor memoirs, is the lengths people went to try and prevent lice, including using makeshift combs, boiling clothes outdoors if possible, a huge energy cost, or even shaving heads despite the intense cold, all in a desperate attempt to avoid typhus. Historians still argue whether the emphasis placed by the Soviet authorities on maintaining public health services, limited though they were, represented a genuine attempt to mitigate suffering, or was primarily aimed at keeping a minimum workforce alive for defense industries, highlighting the complex and often harsh priorities of the state during the crisis. Was public health a humanitarian effort or a military necessity? You look at the people around you, the hollowed-out faces, the shuffling gait, the persistent coughs, the telltale signs of scurvy on their skin. And you see disease layered on top of starvation, layered on top of cold. It's a triple threat, each making the others worse. Getting sick means you can't scavenge, you can't queue for rations, if there even are any. You can't fetch water, you can't gather wood. You become completely dependent, which in a city where everyone is struggling just to keep themselves alive is a dangerous state to be in. Survival isn't just about finding calories, it's about having the strength and health to physically do the things required to find those calories. And disease strips that away, leaving you vulnerable and immobile, another potential number for the grim tally of the day. You try to keep your distance, cover your mouth when you cough, a rare act of consideration, and pray you don't catch whatever is going around, knowing that a simple infection could be the thing that finally extinguishes that tiny spark of life you're clinging to. The vulnerability sickness brings, which we talked about just now, isn't just about making it harder to survive. It accelerates the inevitable. And in this city, during these months, the inevitable has become terribly, overwhelmingly common. You see it everywhere. You walk down the street, and there they are, not hidden away, not in some sterile, distant place. Right there, often huddled against a building, sometimes just collapsed in the snow. Bodies, frozen solid, like macabre statues in this frozen city. At first, the sight is shocking, horrifying. You recoil, perhaps say a silent prayer, maybe even avert your gaze, though that quickly becomes impossible. The sheer number defies avoidance. They become part of the landscape, as common as snowdrifts or shattered glass. It's a grim inventory of the siege's progress, a daily reminder of the dwindling population, of the friends, neighbors, and strangers who simply couldn't hold on any longer. The initial shock gives way to a terrible numbness. You pass them without flinching, your mind perhaps registering another one, or perhaps not even registering it anymore. It's a defense mechanism, a necessary shutdown of empathy to survive. If you felt the full weight of grief for every body you saw, you wouldn't have the energy to take another step. Dealing with the dead becomes a practical, albeit gruesome, problem. Burying them is often impossible. The ground is frozen solid, harder than concrete. There's no fuel to thaw it, no energy to dig. So the bodies remain where they fall, or are sometimes moved to temporary collection points. Imagine that job. People themselves starving and weak, tasked with gathering the frozen dead. They use sleds, the same kind kids might use for playing, now repurposed for the most somber of journeys. Dragging the stiff forms through the snow, stacking them until they can be transported somewhere else. It's a horrifying, dehumanizing process, but it's necessary. The dead can become a health hazard, especially if temperatures rise slightly, which is a chilling thought in itself. Sometimes families try to keep their loved ones at home for a while, unable to bear the thought of them being just another frozen form collected in the street. But space is scarce, heating is non-existent, and keeping a body inside a tiny freezing apartment presents its own set of grim challenges. The concept of a funeral, of wakes, of traditional mourning rituals becomes a distant, almost alien memory. There is no time, no energy, no resources for such things. Death is abrupt, often solitary, and its aftermath is a practical problem of disposal, not a ceremony of remembrance. The scale is overwhelming. People are dying by the thousands each day at the peak of the winter. The official death counts, meticulously recorded by city officials despite the chaos, paint a stark picture, but many historians still argue whether those official tallies truly capture the full extent of the loss, suggesting the real numbers might be even higher due to unrecorded deaths. Getting an accurate count in such pandemonium is like trying to count snowflakes in a blizzard. Bodies might never reach a collection point, or entire families might perish, leaving no one to report their passing. A quirky or fringe tidbit you sometimes hear from survivors' accounts is the lengths people went to store the bodies of their loved ones temporarily, hoping for a proper burial someday. This could mean placing them out on a balcony or in a storage shed, letting the cold preserve them, a desperate attempt to maintain some semblance of dignity and the hope for a future ceremony. It's a heartbreaking image, frozen grief quite literally. You try not to think about it too much. It's easier just to focus on the next step, the next crumb. Death changes everything, including the living. The value of life diminishes, not because people become cruel, though desperation does breed cruelty, but because it's so fragile, so easily extinguished. You learn to expect it. You see someone looking particularly weak one day, and the next day they're just gone. It makes you question the point of it all sometimes. Why bother fighting, queuing, freezing, when the odds seem so stacked against you? But then, somehow, you keep going. Maybe it's instinct, maybe it's hope, buried deep down. Maybe it's just a stubborn refusal to let this be the thing that stops you. The silence can be deafening at times, not just the absence of traffic or industry, but the quietness of a city where so many have died. The vibrant sounds of 1,000,000+ people are gone, replaced by the crunch of snow, the wind, the distant rumble of artillery, and an eerie, palpable stillness. The only crowds you see are the silent ones queuing for bread, or the static crowds that line the streets, frozen in their final moments. It's a profound, unsettling quiet that settles deep into your bones, mirroring the silence in your own heart where grief and fear reside. It's like the city itself is holding its breath, or perhaps it's just stopped breathing altogether. A mainstream historical fact is that the mortality rate during the winter of 1941 to 1942 reached unprecedented levels, with starvation being the primary cause. Though cold and disease were massive contributing factors, weakening people to the point where even a mild illness could be fatal, as we discussed last time. The sheer scale of death overwhelmed all normal systems for handling it. You see the consequences of this scale every single day. The inability to mourn, the practical problems of disposal, the constant, inescapable presence of mortality. It grinds you down, changes your perspective on everything. Life isn't a guarantee, it's a daily, precarious achievement. You learn to navigate around the bodies, a silent choreography of survival. You avoid looking too closely, avoid thinking about who they were, what their dreams were, if they had family waiting. It's too much. You focus on your own cold feet, the gnawing ache in your stomach, the next corner you have to turn. The dead are a warning, a possible future, but for now, you are still among the living, clinging to that fragile status with every numb step. And that, you realize with a start, is really all that matters right now. Just not being one of them. Survival in this city isn't a grand adventure or a series of heroic feats. It's not some movie montage of daring escapes and ingenious traps. No, survival here is, well, it's mostly just boring. Grimly, utterly, soul-numbingly boring. It's a relentless, repetitive cycle of trying not to die, punctuated by small victories like finding an extra potato peel or a stray piece of frozen cabbage stalk. The drama of death, which you see all around you, only serves to highlight the monotonous nature of the living struggle. Your days, if you can call them days when the light is so weak and the energy so low, are defined by a few simple, desperate tasks. The primary task, the cornerstone of this dreary existence, is the queue. Oh, the queues. You've seen queues before, presumably, maybe for concert tickets or a new phone launch back in the before times. But those were energetic, maybe even exciting. These queues? These are different. These are silent, still, and utterly vital. You queue for everything, but most importantly, you queue for bread. This isn't bread as you know it, by the way. It's a dark, heavy, moist substance made with rye flour, cellulose, sawdust, maybe some other things you probably don't want to know about. It's rationed strictly, a few hundred grams per person per day, depending on status. Workers get a bit more, dependents less. This small, dense piece of bread is the foundation of your caloric intake, meager as it is. You wake up if you manage to sleep through the cold and the gnawing hunger, and your first thought is the queue. You bundle yourself in everything you own, layers upon layers of thin, threadbare clothing. You step outside into the perpetual twilight of winter and join the line. It's already long, even before dawn. People stand shoulder to shoulder, shuffling occasionally, saying almost nothing. Conservation of energy is key. Every movement, every word is a calorie spent. So you stand, sometimes for hours, the cold seeping into your bones, your feet growing numb inside ill-fitting boots or wrapped rags. It's a strange social space, the queue. There's a shared misery, a silent understanding, but also a simmering tension. Everyone is desperate. Small infringements, someone trying to cut in, a perceived unfairness in the serving size, can spark brief, intense flashes of anger, quickly suppressed because nobody has the energy for a real fight. It's a microcosm of the city's strained existence, a testament to both resilience and the proximity of despair. You stand there, shivering, stomach aching, watching the slow progress, your entire existence narrowed down to this one single goal: getting your ration of the life-sustaining, unappetizing bread. Beyond the bread queue, there's the constant, low-grade effort of scavenging. This isn't like searching for treasure, it's searching for anything vaguely edible or burnable. Maybe there are frozen potatoes left in a garden after a bombing, or some grass you can try to boil into a terrible soup once the snow melts slightly. Perhaps a discarded piece of wood from a bombed-out building for your tiny stove. You walk the streets, eyes scanning the ground, the rubble, the snowdrifts. It's a hopeful, yet usually disappointing quest. You find very little, but the hope of finding something, anything, keeps you looking. It's like playing a lottery. You always lose, but the prize if you win is slightly less hunger for a few hours. Then there's the rationing. Not just bread, but everything else is rationed too, when it's available at all. Kerosene for lamps, fuel for stoves. If you even have a stove that burns kerosene, many are just makeshift metal boxes. Water. Water often has to be fetched from holes chopped in the frozen rivers, a dangerous and exhausting trek. Imagine chipping a hole in thick ice with numb hands, filling heavy buckets, and hauling them back through the snow. It's back-breaking labor for something you used to get just by turning a tap. And boiling it to make it safe uses precious, precious fuel. Every resource is measured, hoarded, stretched as far as humanly possible. You become acutely aware of the value of a single match, a drop of fuel, a scrap of fabric. The cold is the constant, inescapable antagonist. It's not just uncomfortable, it's actively trying to kill you. Inside your apartment, it might be just a few degrees above freezing, sometimes even below. You wear your outdoor clothes inside. You huddle around a tiny, inefficient stove, burning whatever you could find: wood, furniture scraps, paper, sometimes even books, though the thought of burning books feels like another kind of death. Mainstream historical fact: the winter of 1941 to 1942 was exceptionally harsh, amplifying the effects of starvation and lack of fuel. The cold wasn't just weather, it was a weapon the siege wielded constantly. Keeping warm, or rather trying not to freeze completely, is a full-time occupation. You share body heat if you live with others. You stay in bed as much as possible, under piles of blankets and coats. You perform small, futile exercises to get the blood moving. Your fingers and toes are perpetually numb. Your breath is always visible. A quirky or fringe tidbit is the ingenious, if desperate, methods people devise for heating, like using modified samovars or building tiny enclosed stoves within their rooms, risking carbon monoxide poisoning for a few hours of slightly less bitter cold. It's a stark illustration of how the normal rules of safety are abandoned when basic survival is at stake. The relentless nature of these tasks, queuing, scavenging, rationing, fighting the cold, wears you down mentally as much as physically. There's no respite, no comfort, no break from the struggle. It becomes the new normal. You stop remembering what it felt like to be truly warm, truly full. Your world shrinks to the distance between your apartment and the bread queue, the path to the frozen river, the search for fuel. Historians still argue whether the psychological toll of this monotony and deprivation was as significant a factor in mortality as the physical effects of starvation and cold, suggesting the sheer grinding despair sapped the will to live for many. You move through your day like a slow-motion automaton, focused only on the immediate need. Get bread, find fuel, fetch water, don't freeze, don't starve, don't die. It's a profoundly boring way to exist, but it's existence nonetheless. And right now, existence is the highest possible achievement. You perform these mundane, miserable tasks with a quiet determination, because the alternative is the stillness you see on the streets, the quietness in the queues. You choose the struggle, the cold, the hunger, the boredom. You choose the life, however diminished it is. Survival, you've discovered, isn't just about enduring the physical hardships you considered back in the before times. The hunger, the cold, the exhaustion, the shelling. No, there's another, perhaps even heavier layer to it. It's the presence of death. It's not a rare event here. It's the constant, quiet neighbor in every street, every building, sometimes even within your own walls. You go about your dreary, monotonous tasks, the queuing, the scavenging for fuel or scraps, and death is just there. A still shape bundled in rags under a snowdrift, or a figure that simply stopped moving in the breadline, or a body carefully laid out, if energy allowed for care, in a doorway. It becomes a part of the landscape. Like the ruined buildings or the drifts of snow, the deceased are just present. There isn't the energy, or often the means, for proper ceremony. Sometimes bodies are collected on carts, a slow, grim procession through the silent streets. Sometimes they remain where they fell for a time, the cold preserving them in a macabre tableau. You learn to step around them, to avert your gaze, not out of disrespect, but because you must conserve your own fragile hold on life. Looking too long feels like tempting fate, or expending precious emotional energy you simply don't have. It's an awful, mundane familiarity that you never ever could have predicted. You probably spent more time avoiding awkward eye contact on public transport before all this than you now spend avoiding looking at someone who has ceased to exist. And this constant proximity to the abyss does something to you and to everyone around you. It sharpens the focus on your own immediate survival to an almost unbearable degree. Normal morality, the kind you took for granted back in the world of plentiful food and central heating, begins to fray at the edges. What constitutes right and wrong when the difference between living and dying might be a single potato, a handful of fuel, or a warmer coat? You see things. You see people take things that don't belong to them from unoccupied apartments, or even from the dead. You see those with a little more food guarded with a fierce, animalistic intensity, unwilling to share even a crumb. The ethical choices become stark and brutal. Do you help the person who has fallen in the street, knowing you might not have the strength to get back up yourself? Do you share your meager rations with someone who has none, when doing so means your own will run out faster? Do you turn a blind eye to someone taking something you know isn't theirs, because speaking up might draw unwanted attention, or because deep down you understand the desperation? Your survival instinct, raw and primal, clashes constantly with the remnants of your former humanity, that sense of community and compassion. It's an internal war you fight every moment, often won by the gnawing emptiness in your stomach and the cold in your bones. You might witness acts of incredible kindness, moments where someone defies the logic of survival to help another, sharing a piece of bread or helping someone back to their feet. These moments feel almost miraculous, islands of light in the overwhelming darkness. But you also see the opposite. You see people withdraw, hoard, and sometimes, yes, exploit the weakness of others. It's a harsh truth, but the siege strips away the comfortable layers of civilization, revealing the raw impulses beneath. It's like a twisted reality show, where the prize is staying alive, and the challenges involve navigating a minefield of collapsing social norms. Your modern sensibilities recoil, but the person standing next to you in the queue might just be focused on who looks weakest. One of the most corrosive aspects is the way death becomes depersonalized. There are simply too many losses to mourn each one individually. Grief is a luxury you can't afford. It takes too much energy. You might feel a pang when someone you knew is gone, but the overwhelming feeling is often just a reinforcement of your own precarious position. Every death is a warning. Every still figure is a possible future version of yourself. Mainstream historical fact: estimates of the death toll during the siege vary widely, but most agree it was well over 1 million, primarily due to starvation and disease, far exceeding military casualties. The sheer scale of death was unimaginable. Even the most basic acts of human dignity become difficult or impossible. Burying the dead properly becomes a monumental task. Sometimes bodies are kept in apartments because the ground is frozen too hard to dig graves, or families are too weak to carry them. A quirky or fringe tidbit is how, in the absolute desperation for fuel, people sometimes resorted to using anything combustible, including wood from cemeteries, breaking up fences, or even attempting to move gravestones for fuel, further blurring the lines between respecting the living and the dead. It sounds horrific, and it is, but it speaks to a level of need that overrides deep-seated cultural norms. This constant negotiation with death and dwindling morality is exhausting. It's not just the physical struggle, but the moral weight, the compromises you see others make, and the chilling possibilities of your own behavior under extreme duress. Historians still argue whether the psychological trauma inflicted by witnessing such widespread death and the erosion of social bonds had a lasting impact on the survivors, extending the cost of the siege far beyond the physical recovery. It leaves scars in the soul, questions about humanity that are hard to answer even in safety and comfort. You might find yourself rationalizing things you never thought you would. That extra piece of bread you found, perhaps it fell from someone's less than secure bag. Well, finders keepers, right? They probably wouldn't have survived anyway. That slight hesitation when someone asks for help, you need to save yourself first. You can't help anyone if you're dead. It's a slippery slope, this survival morality, and the bottom is a place you really don't want to contemplate. You just focus on the next step, the next cue, the next tiny bit of warmth, and try not to think too hard about the current living or dead. So you've adjusted in a terrible, soul-crushing way to the constant presence of death. But it's not just the stillness of the deceased that surrounds you. It's the living environment itself that seems determined to bring you closer to that state. The breakdown of city services, which began subtly with reduced transport and intermittent power, has now plummeted to a level of almost unbelievable squalor. You are living, quite frankly, in a giant, frozen open-air toilet, and the consequences for health are devastatingly predictable. The sanitation system is utterly defunct in most places. Sewers froze months ago if they hadn't already collapsed or been damaged by shelling. Waste, both human and animal, though there are precious few animals left, piles up in courtyards, alleys, and former garden plots. The smell, when the temperature occasionally creeps up slightly, is overpowering. A heavy, sickening stench of decay, excrement, and stale air. Even when frozen solid, the presence is undeniable, a constant visual reminder of the health disaster unfolding around you. Getting water involves chipping ice from frozen pipes, if you're incredibly lucky and live near one that wasn't damaged, or more likely, joining the miserable queues at the river or canals, hacking through thick ice to reach the polluted water below. And that water, well, let's just say your average modern water filter would have a nervous breakdown just looking at it. Contaminated is an understatement. Boiling is the only way to make it remotely safe. But fuel, as you know all too well, is a luxury item, so many people drink it as is, hoping for the best, or simply because they don't have the energy or means to boil it. This is a direct highway for diseases, particularly dysentery, which spreads like wildfire. Imagine having a severe stomach bug when you're already starving and weak, with no access to toilet paper and minimal privacy. It's a nightmare you wouldn't wish on your worst enemy, and it's a daily reality for thousands. You learn to interpret the sounds from neighboring apartments with a chilling understanding of who is suffering from what. Then there's the issue of personal hygiene. This isn't just about smelling less than fresh, which everyone does constantly. It's about survival. Washing yourself, your clothes, anything requires precious water and, more importantly, precious heat to melt ice or warm the water. Fuel that could be used for cooking your meager rations or warming your tiny corner of a room. So, you don't wash, not properly, not often, and when you don't wash and you're living in close proximity to others under awful conditions, certain unwelcome guests arrive. Lice. They are ubiquitous, absolutely everywhere. In your clothes, your hair, your bedding, crawling on you day and night. Lice are more than just an itchy nuisance. They are carriers of typhus, one of the most feared diseases of the siege. The symptoms, high fever, headache, rash, delirium, are often a death sentence for bodies already weakened by starvation and cold. You see people scratching themselves raw, desperately trying to rid themselves of the parasites. But it's a losing battle. The sheer scale of the infestation is overwhelming. It's like trying to sweep back the tide with a toothpick. A mainstream historical fact is that typhus epidemics were a major cause of death during the siege, spread by the body lice that thrived in the unwashed, crowded conditions. Controlling lice became a critical, though often impossible, public health challenge. And it's not just typhus and dysentery. Scurvy is rampant due to the complete lack of fresh fruit or vegetables. Your gums bleed, your joints ache, old wounds might reopen. Vitamin deficiencies are universal. Every cough, every sniffle, every ache could be the start of something terminal. A simple cold can easily turn into pneumonia in your weakened state. Your immune system, running on fumes and bark extract, is barely functional when you are a walking target for every pathogen circulating in the city's putrid air and water. Medical facilities, where they still exist, are overwhelmed and undersupplied. Doctors and nurses work heroically, but they have no medicines, no antibiotics. Well, none that would be effective against typhus or scurvy anyway. And often no heat or light in the hospitals themselves. It's less about receiving treatment and more about finding a place, any place, to lie down when you can no longer stand. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that people desperately tried all sorts of folk remedies and homemade cures using whatever sparse ingredients they could find. Concoctions made from pine needles for vitamin C, or attempting delousing with whatever harsh chemicals or heat sources were available, often with limited success and sometimes with dangerous side effects. The ingenuity born of desperation was immense, but rarely a match for the scale of the crisis. Living in this constant state of filth and vulnerability is profoundly dehumanizing. It's hard to maintain any sense of dignity when you're covered in lice, battling dysentery, and the air you breathe is thick with the smell of decay. It grinds you down physically and emotionally. You become accustomed to things you never thought you could tolerate. The smell, the itching, the weakness, the casual conversation about who in the building is currently suffering from what ailment. Historians still argue whether the psychological burden of living in such constant, abject filth and vulnerability, knowing that disease could strike at any moment, contributed significantly to the overall mortality rate, perhaps by crushing the will to survive. It's hard to feel resilient when every breath feels slightly toxic and your own body is a battleground for parasites and pathogens. You might try small, futile acts of cleanliness, rubbing snow on your face, attempting to wash a single sock in melted ice, but they feel like drops in an ocean of overwhelming grime. The sheer energy required for even these small tasks is enormous. It's easier, often, just to let it all wash over you, to sink into the general state of decomposition that seems to have afflicted the entire city. Your skin is perpetually grimy, your clothes stiff with dirt and dried sweat, the itching of the lice a constant, maddening irritant. This isn't the glamorous, dramatic survival you might see in movies. It's a slow, dirty, sickening grind towards potential oblivion, punctuated by coughing fits and the distant rumble of artillery. The physical decay and disease we talked about, that's just one layer. Like a particularly grim layer cake, the bottom is physical suffering, the middle is emotional numbness, and the top is a thick, gray frosting of pure psychological exhaustion. Your mind, much like your body, is running on empty. It feels scraped out. The constant presence of death, the gnawing hunger, the unrelenting cold, the filth, it all coalesces into a state of profound mental fatigue that's unlike any tiredness you have ever known. Forget tired after a long day at work. This is tired of existing. You find yourself losing interest in things that once mattered. Memories feel distant, almost like they belong to another person in another lifetime. The vibrant colors of spring, the taste of fresh bread, the sound of laughter. They are concepts you recall intellectually, but they no longer stir any real emotion. Your emotional range has narrowed dramatically. There's the dull throb of hunger, the sharp pang of cold, a flicker of fear during shelling, and a deep, pervasive apathy that smooths out everything else. Grief, which was initially a sharp, stabbing pain when you lost someone, has dulled into a chronic ache, one of many background noises in your internal landscape. You see death, you register it, and then you move on because you have to find the next scrap of fuel or food. It's not callousness, it's simply self-preservation of the most basic kind. Your brain is rationing its resources, just like the city is rationing bread. Concentration is a monumental effort. Reading is hard because the words swim on the page and your mind wanders back to food. Conversations are clipped and functional, focusing only on immediate needs. Any news? Any fuel? Is anyone ill? Complex thoughts, planning for the future. What future? Even remembering simple things becomes difficult. It's like your brain has been soaked in molasses. Making decisions is exhausting, which is why routine becomes so important. You follow the familiar paths to the waterhole, the ration distribution point, the graveyard, because thinking about alternatives requires energy you just don't have. There's a pervasive sense of isolation, even when you're crammed into a communal apartment with others. Everyone is locked in their own internal struggle, their own private world of hunger and cold. You see the same vacant, hollow look in their eyes that you probably see in your own reflection if you ever bother to look. Empathy is a luxury. You might feel a brief pang for a dying neighbor, but the overwhelming feeling is usually a grim assessment of your own chances. A cold calculation of whether their passing might mean one less person in line for water, or, God forbid, a chance to salvage a tiny piece of their belongings. It's a horrifying thought, and you hate yourself for having it. But the survival instinct is a brutal editor of conventional morality. It's like that scene in a zombie movie where everyone is just looking out for number one, except the zombies are hunger, cold, and despair, and they're already inside the building. Sleep, when it comes, is rarely restful. It's often shallow and plagued by dreams of food, lavish feasts that vanish the moment you wake up, leaving the hunger even sharper. Or dreams of warmth, only to wake shivering in the frigid reality. Sometimes the line between waking and dreaming blurs, and you find yourself having brief hallucinations or moments of confusion. Your mind is playing tricks on you, desperately trying to escape the harsh reality, or perhaps simply malfunctioning from the sheer strain. There are accounts of people seeing loved ones who are no longer there, or hearing sounds that aren't real. Your grip on conventional reality is, shall we say, somewhat tenuous. Maintaining hope feels like trying to cup smoke in your hands. It slips away constantly. You hear rumors of the front, of potential relief, but they are often contradictory and quickly dismissed as wishful thinking. You focus on surviving this hour, maybe this day. The concept of a future stretching out before you feels abstract, maybe even absurd. Why bother hoping for something that feels impossible when all your energy is needed just to put one foot in front of the other? It's easier to just exist in the gray, moment-to-moment reality. A mainstream historical fact is that psychological breakdowns, severe depression, and a state known as alimentary dystrophy, wasting away due to starvation, which had significant psychological effects, were widespread, leading to lethargy and apathy that could be misinterpreted as a lack of will to survive, but was often a direct consequence of starvation and trauma. You might try small things to ward off the complete psychological collapse. Maybe you hum a tune under your breath, or try to recall a poem, or look at an old photograph if you still have one. But these attempts feel fragile, easily crushed by the weight of the surrounding misery. They are tiny islands in an ocean of despair. You might even try to make a light joke, perhaps about how your current diet of boiled belt buckle makes you worry about your iron intake. But the laughter feels thin and brittle, barely masking the scream just beneath the surface. Yeah, belt buckle soup, the worst kind of fusion cuisine. There's a strange kind of detachment that settles in. You observe the suffering around you with a chilling calm. You see people collapse on the street, and you don't run to help. You detour around them, preserving your own minuscule energy. It's not that you've become monstrous, it's that your capacity for emotional response has been blunted. It's a protective mechanism, albeit a grim one. If you allowed yourself to feel the full horror of every death, every tragedy, you would simply cease to function. So you build walls around your heart and mind, thick barriers of numbness and apathy. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some survivors reported a strange kind of hyper-focus on mundane, repetitive tasks, like sorting salvaged items or cleaning a tiny corner of their room, finding a bizarre comfort in the order and predictability of these simple actions as the world outside descended into chaos. It was a way of asserting some control when everything else was out of control. Historians still argue whether this widespread psychological state of apathy and depression, brought on by starvation and trauma, actively reduced people's ability to seek help or take necessary survival actions, thus indirectly contributing to the death toll beyond the direct effects of hunger and cold. Was it simply a symptom, or did it become a deadly factor in itself? It's hard to say, but you know from personal experience how much sheer mental effort is required just to want to survive, and how easily that effort is depleted. You are running on fumes, both physically and mentally. Sometimes the greatest battle is not against the external enemy or the elements, but against the creeping surrender of your own mind. The gnawing emptiness in your stomach that isn't just a feeling anymore. It's a directive. It forces you to look at the world around you with entirely new eyes. The streets you once hurried through, the buildings that were just backdrop to your daily routine, they become potential sources of survival. Scavenging isn't a hobby. It's the full-time occupation of every waking moment not spent queuing. And it's rarely glamorous. Mostly it's just cold, tiring, and often deeply disappointing. You start noticing things you never would have before. Are there any weeds poking through the snow near the park? Which ones might be edible? You try to recall snippets of information you might have heard, maybe from an old relative who knew about foraging in the countryside, or maybe just desperate guesses. Some plants are bitter, some make you sick, but the desperate need overrides caution. Even grass seems appealing, though you quickly learn it offers next to nothing and is hard to digest. It's the ultimate low-calorie snack, less satisfying than chewing on a rubber band. Pigeons, once just feathered nuisances, become coveted prey. You see people standing motionless for long periods, trying to lure them with tiny crumbs, or attempting to trap them with makeshift snares fashioned from wire or string. Catching one is a triumph, a brief infusion of protein in a diet utterly devoid of it. But they are wary, and catching them is incredibly difficult, especially when everyone else has the same idea. You might spend hours in the freezing cold, hands numb, eyes strained, and come away with nothing but frustration and an even deeper sense of hunger. Pets. This is where things get truly grim. The cherished companion and animals that brought comfort in earlier times become an impossible moral dilemma. You see fewer dogs and cats on the streets. People don't talk about it openly, but the quiet understanding hangs in the air. It's a line most people would never have imagined crossing, but hunger has a way of erasing lines. You might hear hushed stories or see a neighbor looking particularly guilt-ridden after a sudden disappearance of their pet. It's a heartbreaking reflection of the extreme pressure people are under. A stark reminder that survival sometimes demands unimaginable choices. It's not exactly gourmet dining, but when your body is screaming for calories, you make do. Anything potentially organic becomes a target. You might try boiling leather, maybe an old boot or a belt, hoping to extract some gelatin or protein, though the result is usually an unappetizing, chewy mess with minimal nutritional value. Wallpaper paste, as mentioned before, if it's the old organic kind, might yield a tiny amount of starch. Old bones, painstakingly boiled down for hours, might create a weak, greasy broth. It's a constant, low-stakes treasure hunt, where the treasure is usually dirt or inedible scraps. These scavenging efforts often lead to the sharing of recipes or survival tips. People swap information in the queues or stairwells. Boil the pine needles. They say you get some vitamins. Did you hear about using boiled potato peelings? If you find an old leather glove, boil it with some salt. It makes the broth slightly less disgusting. These aren't recipes for delicious meals. They are instructions for turning potential poisons or indigestible materials into something that might stave off starvation for another few hours. The creativity born of desperation is astounding. but also profoundly sad. It's like a culinary competition where the ingredients are despair and whatever you can find on the ground. You learn the subtle signs of scavenged materials. The faint smell of boiled leather clinging to someone's clothes. The slightly yellowed fingers from handling dubious plants. The way people's eyes dart towards potential food sources in the environment. It becomes an unspoken language of hardship. Everyone is doing it, or thinking about doing it, or judging others for doing it. A mainstream historical fact is that during the worst periods of the siege, people consumed virtually anything organic they could find, including pets, birds, rats, though these were often diseased, tree bark, moss, and even the starch glue from books and furniture. This wasn't just anecdotal, it was a widespread and desperate reality. A quirky tidbit is that resourceful individuals sometimes tried to cultivate small patches of vegetables in whatever space they could find, like window boxes or tiny courtyards, though the yield was minimal and quickly targeted by hungry neighbors or looters. Imagine trying to grow a carrot under siege conditions. Talk about resilience. Historians still argue whether the authorities could have done more to organize collective foraging or pest control efforts to supplement rations, or if the sheer scale of starvation made individual scavenging the only viable, albeit insufficient, approach. It's another layer of tragic speculation. The search for food becomes a grind. It's not an adventure, just repetitive, often fruitless work that drains your already limited energy. You trudge through the snow, cold and weak, scanning the ground, looking up at trees, poking at rubbish piles. Each failed attempt adds to the cumulative weight of despair, but the hunger pushes you on. You can't stop. You have to keep looking, keep hoping you'll find that one tiny scrap, that one pigeon, that one root that will give you just enough energy to keep looking tomorrow. It's a boring, relentless cycle of desperation and survival. The constant, relentless drain of scavenging, of being cold and hungry all the time, starts to really wear you down. It's not just an inconvenience anymore. It's a profound physical deterioration. Your body feels heavy, sluggish, and brittle all at once. Every movement takes conscious effort. Getting out of bed in the morning feels like lifting a ton of bricks, assuming you even have a bed that isn't frozen solid or occupied by multiple people trying to share warmth. The energy you expend just trying to stay warm is enormous. Your skin becomes papery thin, stretched taut over visible bones. Your hair might start thinning or falling out. You develop dark circles under your eyes that no amount of sleep would ever fix, even if proper sleep were possible. The constant chill seeps deep into your bones, and no amount of layering seems to keep it out entirely. You shiver even when you're inside, a constant, low-grade tremor that vibrates through your exhausted muscles. Remember trying to scavenge those frozen roots or pry open a discarded can? Your hands ache constantly now, swollen and cracked from the cold and lack of nutrients. Frostbite isn't just a risk, it's a frequent, painful reality for many, turning fingers or toes black. A horrifying visual reminder of the body's losing battle against the environment. This physical state profoundly affects your mental state. Concentration becomes incredibly difficult. Holding a complex thought, following a conversation, or trying to plan beyond the next hour's desperate search for warmth or food feels impossible. Your world shrinks down to the most basic, primal needs. Find calories, stay warm, avoid dying. Everything else fades into a hazy, unimportant background. Memories of easier times of meals shared or holidays celebrated feel increasingly distant and unreal, like fragments of a dream. You might struggle to recall simple things, like someone's name or where you put something just minutes ago. It's as if your brain is conserving energy, shutting down non-essential functions. Trying to do anything that requires mental effort, like reading a book or even holding a detailed conversation, feels like trying to run a marathon when you haven't eaten in a week. It's exhausting and usually futile. Apathy starts to set in. You see suffering around you, people collapsing in the streets, neighbors growing visibly weaker, children with swollen bellies. And while the initial shock is horrifying, a protective numbness starts to develop. You can't afford the emotional energy to fully process the scale of the tragedy. because that energy is needed just to put one foot in front of the other. It's not that you stop caring entirely, but the immediate, overwhelming need to survive your own ordeal pushes empathy to the back burner. It's a coping mechanism, a shield against the unbearable reality, but it also makes the world feel incredibly lonely. You might pass someone huddled in a doorway, barely conscious, and instead of rushing to help, you might instinctively quicken your step, conserving your own precious energy and avoiding a scene that would drain you both physically and emotionally. It feels awful, but the drive to survive is a powerful, overriding instinct. It turns out Maslow's hierarchy of needs is less about self-actualization and more about, can I eat this dubious thing I found? Social interactions become strained. The shared experience of suffering creates a strange kind of bond. But the intense competition for resources, that extra ration, that usable piece of scavenging material, that spot near the stove, if there is one, also breeds suspicion and resentment. People you once knew well might seem like strangers, driven by a desperation you barely recognize. Gossip and rumors, often about who found what or who is hoarding supplies, become rampant, fueled by paranoia and hunger. The usual social niceties crumble under pressure. Please and thank you feel almost absurd when discussing trading a frozen potato for a lump of questionable fat. It's a stark reminder that civilization in many ways is built on a foundation of basic security and sufficiency. Remove that foundation, and things get primitive. A mainstream historical fact is that during the siege, death rates from starvation and cold soared dramatically, with estimates of total civilian deaths ranging from 600 to 1.5 million. The cold was particularly deadly, exacerbating the effects of malnutrition and making outdoor survival incredibly difficult. A quirky tidbit is that people often shared space in apartments to try and pool heating resources or simply body heat, leading to incredibly crowded, unhygienic, and emotionally fraught living conditions. Imagine being packed into a tiny room with a dozen freezing, starving people. Not exactly the ideal roommate situation. Historians still argue whether the psychological toll of the siege, including the widespread apathy and breakdown of social norms, was as significant a factor in mortality as the physical deprivations, or if it was primarily a consequence of the extreme conditions rather than an independent cause. It's a grim chicken and egg scenario. Sleep when it comes is rarely restful. You're either too cold, too hungry, or too anxious. Nightmares are common, often about food or being chased. Waking up is a disappointment, a return to the grinding reality. There are no lazy mornings. Every day is a repetition of the same struggle. The days blur into one another, marked only by the distribution of the meager rations, if they arrive, and the constant search for anything else to put in your mouth. It's boring in its monotony, terrifying in its consequences. Your life has become a loop of survival tasks, stripped of any comfort or joy. You are a machine driven by hunger, fueled by desperation, operating on fumes. Just when it feels like the gray, starving monotony is all there is, that the cycle of cold, hunger, and exhaustion will never break, something shifts. Very slowly at first, like the first crack in a frozen river. Whispers start circulating, louder now, about a lifeline across Lake Ladoga. The ice is thick enough. Trucks are moving. It's a desperate gamble, incredibly dangerous under constant bombardment. But it's something. It's hope. Fragile as thin ice, but it's there. You hear it and something tightens in your chest, a feeling you haven't experienced in months. Anticipation, maybe? This becomes known as the road of life, a perilous route across a frozen lake, transporting vital supplies. Into the city and evacuating some people out. The supplies arriving are still terrifyingly meager compared to the need, but they are different, more predictable. Grain, fuel, maybe even some desperately needed medicine. The rations might tick up by a few precious grams. It feels like winning the lottery after living in a hole. You see trucks returning from the lake, covered in ice and snow. And it's not just a vehicle, it's a symbol, a promise that you haven't been entirely forgotten, that the outside world still exists and is trying, however imperfectly, to reach you. Getting out via this road is another ordeal. If you are one of the lucky ones chosen for evacuation, maybe a child, maybe someone critically ill, the journey is brutal. Packed into freezing trucks, crossing a lake under enemy fire, it's a desperate dash for survival that replaces one form of horror with another. But for many, the hope is simply that something is coming in. That maybe, just maybe, the worst is over, or at least becoming slightly less awful. The death rate starts to slow its terrifying climb, a grim victory measured in fewer bodies found frozen in doorways each morning. The quality of life, however, remains unimaginably difficult for a long, long time. Even with the road of life, food is still scarce. The city is still under siege. The cold persists. The physical damage done to your body isn't just erased by a slightly bigger ration. Those aches, the chronic fatigue, the damaged organs from months of starvation, they linger. Your hair might grow back, but your teeth might be ruined. Your skin might regain some elasticity, but your muscles might remain weak. The constant gnawing hunger might lessen, but the memory of it, the primal fear of not having enough, is seared into your brain. You might find yourself hoarding scraps long after food becomes more available, unable to break the ingrained habit of deprivation. It's like your body and mind are still fighting a war that's technically over, or at least winding down. Imagine finally getting a decent meal, but your stomach can only handle a few spoonfuls before rebelling. That's the kind of readjustment many faced. The psychological scars run even deeper. Remember that apathy and that emotional numbness you developed to cope? It doesn't just vanish because a few trucks made it across a lake. You've seen things, done things, felt things that change you fundamentally. The trust you lost in other people, the constant suspicion, the chilling realization of what humans are capable of, and what you were capable of under extreme duress. Reconnecting with normal society, if and when that happens, is incredibly hard. Small inconveniences that people complain about seem utterly trivial, almost offensive compared to burying your neighbor in a frozen park. Laughter feels alien at first. The world outside the siege seems strangely bright, loud, and frivolous. A mainstream historical fact is that the siege of Leningrad was finally lifted on January 27, 1944, after 872 days. The road of life across Lake Ladoga played a crucial role in sustaining the city during the harshest period, particularly the winter of 1941-1942. A quirky tidbit is that even after the siege was lifted, the nutritional state of the population was so poor that post-siege mortality remained high for some time due to lingering health issues and the effects of chronic malnutrition. Historians still argue whether the long-term psychological impact on the survivors, including widespread PTSD and difficulty reintegrating into peacetime society, was adequately addressed by the Soviet authorities in the years following the war. The scale of the trauma was immense. Even as conditions agonizingly slowly improve, the boring survival phase leaves a permanent mark. The simple things that were luxuries, a warm room, a full stomach, clean water, undisturbed sleep, become things you can never take for granted again. You survived, yes, but the person who went into the siege is not the same person who came out. The bark and leather you ate, the cold you endured, the sights you witnessed, they are now part of your history, etched into your very being. You learned the most fundamental lessons of survival, stripped bare of all comfort and convenience. It's a knowledge that is both terrifying and in a strange way, makes everything else seem less daunting. After surviving that, what could possibly be that bad? Okay, maybe public speaking. The taste of real bread, when you finally get it, is something you will never forget. It's not just food, it's hope, wrapped in calories, and the quiet hum of relative peace, the absence of constant fear and hunger, becomes the sweetest sound imaginable. It's over. You made it. Now dim the lights even further. Maybe turn off that fan if you prefer absolute quiet tonight. Let the images of the frozen city, the constant hunger, the slow fight for survival, gently fade away. You are warm now. You are safe. The hard ground, the gnawing emptiness, the chilling cold, they are just stories from a distant, difficult past. Let your breathing slow down, become deep and even. Feel the weight of your body sinking into your bed or chair. There is no need to scavenge, no need to huddle for warmth. No need to worry about tomorrow's meager ration. All of that is far away. Just stillness, quiet, and rest.